Good afternoon. Welcome to City Club. It's great to see such a large crowd here for this presentation, and we're here for the presentation of journalist Vaughn. My name is Jim Britton, and I am the current president of the Whatcom County City Club. The mission of City Club is to inform, connect, and engage the community to strengthen the civil health of our region. We emphasize civil conversations and listening to others. We begin by acknowledging with humility that the land we are on today is the territory of the people of the Salish Sea. Their presence is imbued in the waterways, shorelines, valleys, and mountains of the traditional homelands of the coastal Salish Seas people, and it has been that way since time immemorial. As always, I'd like to thank all the volunteers who have put time in and made this possible. And in addition, I'd like to acknowledge those organizations and people who have specifically provided support for us on an ongoing basis. And those include the Peace Health St. Joseph's Medical Center, Bruce and Claudia DeSen, Danny Neal, real estate broker with the Molya Group, Firehouse Arts and Event Center, Colshan CPAs, Opportunity Council, Pacific Continental Realty, Unity Care Northwest, Village Books, Western Washington University, Whatcom Community Foundation, and the Salish Current. And also a big thanks today for our caterer at Good Bowl. So would you acknowledge all those people, please? So for those of you who are not members, I'd like to encourage you to become a member. By doing so, you're going to be supporting our ability to continue to offer these great programs. And to do so, dues are $40 a person, $70 a household, or $10 for those who are under 25. And in addition, if you're a member, you get a reduction in the price of the lunch. If you're interested, you can do so in several ways. If you're interested in becoming a member, you may do so in several ways. One of which is to go to the website, and you can be guided through becoming a member. Another is on each of the tables, there's a yellow form, and you could fill that out. And then if you leave it there, we will pick it up, and then we will follow up with you in terms of getting your dues paid. Or if you'd like to go ahead and take care of it today in person, you may see our treasurer, Zach, who's waving right back there, and he would take care of that for you. As usual, we will not have a program this December, so our next program is going to be on January 22nd, 2025. And it's on the future of water availability across Whatcom County, including Bellingham. And it relates to even private wells, utilities, and wildlife. It will address our stake in water adjudication case, and you'll learn what to expect as the Whatcom County Superior Court addresses the issues in the largest lawsuit in Washington's history. To give you a sense of the resource allocation for this, Whatcom County was recently allocated a new Superior Court judge position so that there is now one Superior Court judge who is dedicating his entire time to engaging and resolving these water matters. So this will be huge for the county. So it ought to be a great program, and I suspect that there are many things most of us do not know about what's at stake and what is happening and what may happen. So I also I'm reminding you please to, if you haven't done so already, please silence your phones. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator for the program, Jane Freudenberger. Thank you.
It's great to see so many people here. You weathered the cyclone, I guess. So I was afraid no one would be here today. Okay, we are very happy to welcome Vaughn Palmer here today. Many of you remember him from many other visits he's made to City Club. His insights from a distance help us to see our political scene in the context of the world, not just our local national politics. For all our newer members, Vaughn has held many positions at the Vancouver Sun in his over 50-year career there. He's best known for his political commentary, where he has covered the rise and fall of 8 premiers. In 2006, he won the Bruce Hutchison Lifetime Achievement Award, the most prestigious journalistic honor in Canada, because, as the editor-in-chief of the Vancouver Sun said, the man is unbeatable, simply a superb journalist. And now we're going to see how true that is as Vaughn comes up and tells us what lies ahead. Thank you.
Very much. I hope you can all hear me. Don't let it go to my head. Look, even my false modesty is fake. So it was wonderful to be back here because it has been a while, and kind of put my life on hold during the pandemic for a while. My wife and I, of course, are in our 70s and also dutiful Canadians, so we do what we're told to do. We're the old joke about the one standing at the walk sign on Vancouver's downtown east side because we're more worried about disobeying the town. I knew I was going to screw that up. We're more worried about disobeying the sign than we are about having our lives endangered by being on Vancouver's downtown east side. So I was heard. It was interesting to hear the list of sponsors because St. Joseph's is on the list, right? And I was thinking I should drop by St. Joseph's this afternoon to see if there are any British Columbians there because the BC government hasn't publicized this widely. But we've been sending patients to St. Joseph's for 2 years now to deal with the backlog for radiation treatment in British Columbia. This is all expenses paid visits. BC government picks up the entire cost, of course, done on a contract. But they also provide travel, and if your family member wants to come with you to hold your hand while you're having the treatment, they'll pay for that as well. So this isn't an aspect of the Canadian healthcare system that is widely advertised, but I did think, it may be interesting to drop by and see that. Since the pandemic, my wife Dale and I have been renewing our relationship with the United States. And, somebody said, are you going to say anything positive? So let me start off on that. We've spent a 5-week road trip through the Southwest, 3-week road trip to Los Angeles, 2 long stints at our favorite place on the beach in Oregon. Been to Seattle, see the art shows there. Trip to Washington, D.C. for art shows. Altogether, I'd say in the last 18 months, we've probably been 3 months in the United States. And it was wonderful. What we've always found, everyone's friendly, terrific place, great to move around. It won't surprise you because I'm sure you know Canadians who are horrified about various aspects of the United States. And, I get this too when I go back and I go, well, there's parts of Vancouver that I wouldn't venture into in the daytime. Our beautiful little town of Victoria. If you visited Victoria's got a ferociously nasty tent encampment right downtown now. That's so bad that the first responders, ambulance attendants, will not go there for drug overdoses unless there's a police detachment with them because they get attacked. And when I think about that, I kind of start to go, the problems across the Western world are not as unique as it feels like when you're in the midst of one of your elections. We just had an election in British Columbia. And I was sitting down this morning and I was thinking about the issues that came up in BC that, in the large sense, are similar to the issues that were debated in the United States election. Our BC election is the closest in provincial history. The government of Premier David Eby managed to hang on to his majority in our legislature by one seat, and he won that seat by 22 votes. Everybody tells you voting doesn't matter. 22 votes the other way, he'd be minority, he might be bargaining. We've always in BC over the years told the story, to make the point that voting matters, we've always in BC over the years told the story about the guy, member of our legislature, lost his seat on a recount by one vote. And admitted, this isn't something I would have ever admitted publicly, but he admitted publicly that he and his wife had forgotten to vote. Now, I told my wife that story, and she said, "Why would you assume I would have voted for you?" Fair enough. We've now had the closest election in history. So some of the stuff that we talked about and argued about, and that affected what happened, we've seen this right across Canada. We've seen it across the Western world, and you've seen it here. We'll start with public disorder. So British Columbia went into decriminalization of drugs in a big way. We went into safe injection sites in a big way. We went into safer supply, publicly funded substitutes for the dangerous drugs to reduce the death rate. And pretty much everything has gone badly and sideways. I double-checked the numbers this morning. We still have very close to the highest death rate from fentanyl overdoses in North America. Some years we're competing with West Virginia. But our per capita rate is double what it is in Washington State. So we've got that seriously. We still have governments and politicians that seriously support the idea of safer supply and safe injection sites, but I can tell you that any politician who supports it doesn't live next to one, because there's all kinds of social problems in the neighborhood. Like Oregon, we backed away from decriminalization. They went into it first. We went into it later. We're backing away from it. But that whole range of issues around homeless encampments, violence, repeat violent offenders, all those issues, big issue in British Columbia too. And one of the things that I notice about it that comes back again and again is the people in charge, our minister in charge of policing, public safety, some of the police authorities will tell you, well, the statistics are coming down. You hear that, right? The trouble in that realm of public discussion is that anecdotes trump statistics. And I guess we can still use trump as a verb. Sorry. But in any event, you know, some guy gets his hand cut off in Vancouver outside the Queen Elizabeth Theatre in downtown. That kind of undoes 3 weeks of the government telling you the crime statistics are down. In Victoria, a woman got attacked wheeling her baby through a downtown neighborhood in a stroller. That overwhelms that. We had a young woman, murdered in her home in Surrey by a repeat violent offender who was out on bail. The public relates to that more than some report that the statistics have changed, right? And I think that is one general area of public discussion that in election campaigns, you know, they always say that the plural of anecdotes is not data, but the public relates to the anecdotes. Another big issue in British Columbia during the election, very close call, was cost of living, inflation. Well, again, this is the realm where statistics rule. And I remember, I quoted it to myself. The Economist did a cover story just before the American election, talking with full of statistics. Inflation rates coming down, employment. America doesn't need its economy fixed. It's already a great economy and all that. I was really struck watching the saturation coverage of the election. It's the same kind of statistic that undid the government's claims in British Columbia. was the famous John King of CNN had a big display on the big board. It was American counties where the rate of inflation was greater than the average wage settlement over the last 2 years. And his point was that people on budgets who buy their groceries, it does no good to tell them the inflation rate's coming down if they're paying more for their groceries than they got in a pay raise last year. I would say again that just as the crime public disorder problem, there's a gap between the leaders who have the statistics at their fingertips but don't live in the neighborhoods where the problem is biggest. There's a gap on cost of living in both countries between families on a budget where these kind of details matter. The grocery deal is a big deal. And people in government, particularly the decision makers at the top, who don't deal with that in their everyday lives. We had an election in British Columbia a few years ago that was won on the first day by the opposition leader. John Horgan just died. He's a very popular premier in BC history. And on the opening day of the campaign, he said he was going to get rid of the tolls on bridges. So we had 2 bridges in BC that were built with toll dollars and funded with toll dollars. And the government said we got them built because the tolls paid for the bridge, which it would have over 35 or 40 years. But the problem with the tolls were, oh, come on, it's less than a coffee at Starbucks every day, right? It's $3 or whatever. But the thing that Horgan figured out was people who were commuting back and forth on that bridge every day to get to their job, they were now spending more than they were paying for auto insurance. They were paying $1,500 a year to go to and from work in tolls, and the average auto insurance from the government-run auto insurer was $1,400. And they were on a budget. They were paying $1,500 that they didn't have in their budget before the tolls went on. And he said he was going to take them off. When the votes were counted in that election, he had won pretty much every riding where people were going back and forth across those 2 bridges. And again, we call this populism, but to me, it's more a case of relating to the lives, particularly working people who are on budgets, families, taking their kids to school, all that stuff. And those 2 issues went against the government. The government in British Columbia had a rough time on those issues, and the result was, as I said, they almost lost the election. A couple of other things that came up in our election that I think are relevant in general terms. One of my tours, when we went down to Los Angeles, I have a group of friends down there who are now all retired, unlike me. They were all in the same journalism fellowship with me at Stanford University 40 years ago. And so I visited them all. They didn't much want to talk about politics. They covered politics and government, and I was polite. I didn't ask them what they thought of the election in the United States that year or anything, because it was obviously not a happy subject for them, and they were retired. Why the hell should they have to deal with this stuff again? So I left them alone. But I do think it's important to talk about what's happened to my business and my industry. So, journalism. My newspaper doesn't have anything like the number of reporters it had. I was city editor of the paper some years ago, many years ago, and we had 50 reporters working for us. And that was just in the news department. There's still sports and lifestyle and all those other departments. I don't think we have 50 employees overall working for the whole paper. And that happened right across the industry. It's nothing special about the Vancouver Sun, Seattle Post-Intelligencer. My old friend Joel Connolly used to work there. It's gone right across the industry. It's affected the cable industry. I used to have an hour-long show on a cable channel in British Columbia. That's gone. I used to do a weekly commentary on Canadian news for NPR in Seattle. That's gone. I used to be on PBS station Channel 9 talking about Canadian news. That's gone. And that's me, but that's everybody. There is just less reporting staff, and more people are getting their news from particularly social media. And everybody in my industry complains about this all the time, although we also use social media as a research tool and to interview people and to gather information, so it's two-faced at best. But I would say that in addition to the decline in reporting staff, you have to be careful what you say about this, but I think there's been a shift in the focus of what we pay attention to. I think we see an awful lot of reporting, even in the best news organizations, that isn't what we do best, which is reporting. What are they saying? How does it differ between what they did? What's working and what's not working? Getting out there, covering them. I'm seeing more and more coverage that doesn't really fit into that category. One who we shall not name has made the term fake news. But I'll give you a couple of examples just from the recent campaigns. And I pick ones, I'll start with ones in British Columbia. We had a large series of controversies in BC during our election over what Canadians have termed bozo eruptions. I don't know if you've heard the term. But bozo eruptions go back to an election that occurred in the province of Alberta about 12, 15 years ago, where a bunch of people running for the legislature who turned out to have said a number of very unfortunate things on social media, as do we all. And some of the stuff was so obnoxious and so new in the sense that people hadn't been held to account for the kind of thing they might have shouted in a bar before social media came along, but they wouldn't necessarily have put into print without thinking on Twitter. And a lot of those people had to drop out. And it was assumed that that would be fatal going forward. That if you ever got caught doing that kind of thing, well, that would be it. And one of the parties running for our legislature had so many new people running for it, Conservatives. They came second. They hadn't elected anybody to the BC legislature under their own name since 1978. They hadn't formed a government in BC under their own name since the 1920s. So they're kind of a new party, and there were an awful lot of people running for them who'd had trouble with impulse control on social media. One of their opposition parties put its research staff to work and produced a 200-page dossier of stupid things, racist things, appalling things that these people had said on social media. And the initial thought was, well, that's it. They're gone, right? No. Many of them survived. Many of them survived. They got away with vague, generalized apologies. They got away with saying, well, yeah, but that was 10 years ago, you know. I said something awful and racist 10 years ago, but that's not what I think now. And we went through an election where afterward it was hard to figure out what the hell all that meant. Did it mean that people didn't care? Or did it mean that two things had happened? One, there was a feeling that people shouldn't be shamed out of running for office on the basis of something they'd said or posted 7 or 10 years ago. Or that people, the voters, were going, you know, there's more important issues here. I'm more worried about the cost of living, or about public safety, or about the guy who got his hand cut off, or about the cost of housing, which in British Columbia is appalling, or about drug overdoses. And I can't afford to decide my vote on the basis of some idiot who, well, one of the people that got dropped did get dropped. He was a medical doctor, and he argued that the COVID-19 vaccine would magnetize you. I do wonder at times where do people even get these ideas, but in any event, that was his thing. So it turned out not to be the governing story of the election, that these awful things that people said and did. And afterward you go, oh, yeah, well, okay, the rest of the, half the electorate's a bunch of racists and ignoramuses, and they like that. Or more possibly you go, you know what? They may have had other things on their mind. These are troubled economic times, and there's a lot of people out there, including a lot of young people, which is interesting, who feel that the system isn't really working for them. I hear from many, many young people in British Columbia who feel like they'll never be able to afford a house because we have some of the highest housing prices in the world in British Columbia, in Vancouver in particular. And, yeah, great, if your parents have helped you buy a place, but that's creating a class division in British Columbia, too. So I think that's one thing that's happening there. And the other one, I could point to... my favorite example from the election campaign, my two favorite examples, I used to be the music critic. So that's a transition somewhat from being the rock music critic to being political columnist, although I always say that if you don't really know British Columbia politics until you understand why that's not entirely a crazy transition, but there were two popular music stories during the American election, which you could look it up. These got enormous publicity. One was Taylor Swift's endorsement of the Democratic Party candidate. And there were all kinds of stories done about how, this was going to tip the election, right? Swifties. Now look, I admire Taylor Swift enormously. I was a music critic. No one in the history of the music industry has ever beaten the record companies until Taylor Swift came along. She did. She is a phenomenon. She has been well described as an entire economy disguised as a young woman. However, the first thing that didn't occur to all the people who said this was going to tip the balance in the election was a lot of her fans aren't old enough to vote. And the second thing is people pay huge attention to celebrities, but they don't necessarily let the celebrities tell them how to vote. My age, my generation, Bruce Springsteen, okay? Bruce Springsteen. Springsteen did a very nice endorsement, as he did with Obama and everybody before him. But here's the problem. One of Springsteen's best songs is Youngstown, about Ohio. Steel mills. They're gone. America's forgotten them. Youngstown in 2016 did not vote for Springsteen's candidate. It voted for Trump. My guess is they probably did this time, too. It's the disconnect between the wealthy celebrity lifestyle and the electorate is vast, as I think Hollywood discovered. It must be a very brave thing in Hollywood to announce you're a Democrat. I mean, you're all alone, right? I think we paid an awful lot of attention to the celebrity side of the election without thinking through. So, on the journalism thing, in 2016, my journalism fellowship at Stanford had a reunion. And I was at a table, think back to the year 2016, July, and talking to a young woman who was covering Donald Trump for National Public Radio. And she gave us a really vivid account. This is the first I'd ever heard of what it was like, to be penned up and herded around and have people yell at you and all that. Also at the table was a guy from the BBC in London. He'd just covered the Brexit vote. And he said, the BBC believed the opinion polls. They all said that the UK was going to vote to remain. And he said everybody I knew was going to vote to remain because we all worked for the BBC. And we all lived in London, and London voted remain, right? But UK voted for Brexit. He turned to the young woman from National Public Radio and he said, the most important thing you can tell your listeners is Donald Trump can win this thing. I go through it all and go, in British Columbia. We were told the election was close, but there was a lot of discounting of the chances of the Conservatives. Toward the end, we thought the New Democrats were going to win easily, and as I said, it was the closest election in history. The opinion pollsters have not figured out what's happening with the public in these things. The UK Guardian had a great piece the other day. They pointed out that while the pollsters all got the American election result wrong, the 5 agencies that do predictive voting betting all called it for Trump, as people betting their own money on the election. There was very little coverage beforehand that that was the case, but those agencies weren't surprised. So, collectively, we're not, as societies, we're not recognizing the forces that are loose out there that genuinely think the society's not working very well for them. And whether that's people on budgets, or people waiting for health care, or people who think that the housing prices are too high and they'll never be able to own one, or people who actually have to go through the places in the city that aren't safe. British Columbia, big problem with people taking their children to the bus stop, and the bus stop's been taken over by homeless people or drug addicts. They can't leave their kids there. They have to drive them to school if they have a car. And you put all that together, and there is something, even, for many, many people, that's not working very well. And in the wake of an election with a result that scared a lot of people, including on both sides of the border, maybe there ought to be more reflection on that. I said I was going to say some positive things at the end, and I want to talk about something, the local issue. I'll take questions and somebody can ask me what Canadians are saying about Donald Trump. We're worried about tariffs. Of course, So Trump's initial tariff statement was 10% tariffs. Well, I'm from British Columbia. Joe Biden's government just slapped us with 14% on softwood lumber. So Trump will be a discount for us. Now, it may not work out that way, but in any event, but we've been fighting about softwood lumber across the border forever. The very first American president to impose a tariff on lumber coming in from what was then called British North America, George Washington. So us kind of got deep roots, this lumber dispute. I don't expect it's going to get sorted out no matter who's president. I wanted to say a few words, however, about what I take this regional story, and to me, it's one of the great examples of how you can cooperate across the border and get along. So, in 1948, there was a horrible flood on the Fraser River and on the Columbia River. Wiped out Vanport, Oregon, which is just opposite Vancouver, Washington, but isn't there anymore, and got completely wiped out. And the governments on the two sides of the rivers decided that it was necessary to start controlling water levels on the Columbia to prevent flooding in the future. Took them a while to sort it out. Took them, the treaty to manage the water flow in the Columbia River was finally signed by Lyndon Baines Johnson and Lester Pearson, the Prime Minister of Canada, and they did the ceremony at Blaine at the border at the Peace Arch because the province of British Columbia was going to be heavily involved in it. It was such a big deal at the time that Time magazine put the Premier of British Columbia on the cover on its international edition, and that's when Time was a big deal. And the treaty was a work of art. The two countries agreed that the key was to build a bunch of storage dams in Canada to hold back the water and then let the water out through the year. And it would be used downstream to generate electricity and to run the towboat industry in Washington State and all kinds of other stuff. And in Canada, when you spill the water through, it would generate electricity, and we'd get the electricity because it's our dams. But they did something else. Two other things that are amazing. The United States paid for the dams in Canada. Lyndon Johnson handed over a check to the Premier of British Columbia for $280 million when that was real money. And that paid for the dams in Canada. And they agreed on something else. They agreed that since the water would be held back and it would be spilled out over the year, that would create more electricity, manageable flow of electricity, in the American dams, the Grand Coulee, Chief Joseph, the other ones, the one at the Dalles, and therefore Canada was entitled to a share of that. And we got a share. They were called the Columbia River Entitlement, although given what the kind of fuss the word entitlement makes these days, I wish they'd called it something else. We called it the downstream benefits. And the deal was, it was agreed on how much that would be every year. We didn't need the electricity, so what we do is we take it on paper, but Bonneville Power mostly sells it to Americans and pays us for it. And that can be a lot of money in a big year. It's hundreds of millions of dollars some years and more than that, but it was part of the treaty. But, you know, treaties come to an end, and the Columbia River Treaty has a reopener clause. And they reopened the clause and discussed it. So the American position was, we paid for the dams are built, they're doing their job, you're getting the electricity, so that part of the treaty really should retreat into history. The second thing was, fair point, why should we be paying you for electricity you don't actually take and don't need, and that we're selling to Americans who are paying too much for power? Well, they went around the table for a long time on that. It took them almost as much to negotiate the amended treaty as it did the original treaty, but in August they signed an agreement in principle on the amended treaty. And it's not a bad deal. Canadian governments have kind of downplayed it, but essentially the entitlement, the downstream thing, is being reduced to 30%, being reduced by 30%, effective the 1st of August, and then over the next few years it'll drop to 50%. So we're still getting some electricity generated in the United States, and we can use it as we see fit, or sell it, or take the money, but nothing like it used to be. And the American utilities will be able to say to their ratepayers that since they're not paying this premium to Canadians for power we're not taking, they'll be able to offer cheaper electricity rates. And in the treaty are some things, the revised treaty are some things that nobody thought much about way back in the 1960s when the original treaty was done. There's some consideration in there for the indigenous people who lost their salmon runs when the dams were built, although Grand Coulee had already pretty much eliminated those. There is money in there for the environment and for environmental considerations. Again, not something people thought about then. And the American government is now going to pay Canada for the actual flood control benefits directly, not imputed. There will be some money for that every year, and there will be a managed agreement across the border on how to do that. Well, this treaty has already been managed, as I say, since the 1960s. And most years it's managed by public servants working off the side of their desk at BC Hydro, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and Vaughn. It isn't something that high levels of government deal with. And it's gone pretty well. It's worked pretty well. I guess you'd have to say now the outstanding question is, what will happen to the revised treaty? Canada has accepted it and endorsed it. The American negotiation team, the Biden administration negotiating team, says they think it's a pretty good set of trade-offs. As you know, the Senate has to pass treaties and amended treaties, and the Senate is somewhat preoccupied these days, so it hasn't actually got around to dealing with this. And presumably it will be the next Senate, the one that takes office in January, or the senators who take office in January, who decide whether or not this thing should go ahead. So I guess what I would say is, if you look around the world, you find a giant river managed across the border between two countries on these principles for 60 years, and where they've come up with a not a bad trade-off to keep going forward, its chances, one hopes, are pretty good. There's been some suggestion, I know, on this side of the border that maybe the clawback of the downstream benefits should be greater. I wouldn't want to give away the Canadian government's negotiating position, but my guess is that the people at the table kind of went, okay, well, we'll see if this flies, or maybe we'll water it down a little bit more, if you don't mind the use of the water analogy for a water management treaty. But to just finish it up, before I take questions, I suggested you're going to be talking about water coming up. So you'll all be familiar with the issue of the Nooksack River flooding. Water flows downhill and the land slopes into Canada, so we end up getting the floodwater. And again, we have been talking for years about some kind of flood management problem system on the Nooksack. Dikes, maybe? Well, if you dike a river, all you do is you push the water downstream, and you're going to move the flooding from Canada to the United States. So you need a pretty good system, and it'll be expensive. And I've suggested to politicians on our side of the river that we're getting the flood control. And there's a precedent. When the United States got the flood control in the Columbia River, they paid for the dams. Why don't we suggest paying for the dikes? Why don't we say, we understand there's a problem in Washington State. We want world-class protection on both sides of the river. And the Canadian government, because we're getting the first row of benefits on this, our farmland is flooding seriously now. We could talk about it. Well, we'll see. I tend to be a bit Pollyanna-ish, as you can tell from the way I talk about stuff. But I'd like to just leave it at that and say, hey, we've managed some very, very difficult things across the border between us, Washington State and British Columbia, and maybe we can work on this one too and get somewhere, and maybe the future isn't as dark as some people think it is on the basis of an election result. Thank you very much.
You make it sound... There's another problem between us, and that is the Trans Mountain Pipeline and the Salish Sea that we're all worried about, and the new, all the ships that are coming out of Tawasin now down the Salish Sea. And how much responsibility is Canada going to take when there's an oil leak?
This is very good. We had a member of the BC legislature who, for 3 years during the debate over the Trans Mountain Pipeline, used to post every day tankers in the Strait of Juan de Fuca between Victoria, where I live, and Port Angeles. Most of them were tankers coming to and fro Washington State, which has, 5 refineries? From Alaska, and had been doing it since the development of oil in Alaska. There's a relatively small number of tankers coming out of British Columbia because the pipeline was small. This argument went nowhere on either side of the border, that we've been putting up with this for a long time, and all we were doing was shifting the balance of oil shipments from the United States to Canada. The pipeline is now running. The new federal government, Canadian government, bought 2 special spill collection ships, which are tied up on the waterfront near me in Victoria. I see them every day. So that's a bit reassuring. The Port of Vancouver has them as well. And so far, so good. The BC government promised to fight the pipeline with every tool in the toolbox, but it turned out that they didn't. The Canadian government bought it. The British Columbia government was going to fight it with every tool in the toolbox, but Canadian provinces, you know, they have delusions about how much power they had, but it turned out they didn't have much. The Premier of Alberta said that it turned out that the tools in the British Columbia government's toolbox were made by Fisher-Price. So the pipeline is done, and fingers crossed. I will say that I believe the only serious spill associated with the Alaska oil in and out of Washington State was in the harbor in Port Angeles a few years ago, and they managed to clean it up fairly quickly. So we're kind of hoping that the same thing here. We'll see. That's where it stands with the TMX pipeline at the moment.
Okay. So let's keep on climate for a minute. With Trump likely pulling out of the Paris Accords again, who in the other nations will take center stage on climate? And we might renege on all our climate policies.
Well, the retreat on climate action is sobering. British Columbia established North America's first carbon tax in 2008. It's one of the few things we've ever done that has ever solicited an entire editorial in the New York Times. That tax survived an election where the opposition party was going to get rid of it. And for 10 years, it just went away as an issue. I covered British Columbia elections where there was no talk of getting rid of the carbon tax. Our national government brought in its own carbon tax, applied it across the country, and it did it in the middle of the cost of living thing. And public support for the carbon taxes unraveled. In the middle of the election we just had in British Columbia, the climate change fighting government of British Columbia said we're going to phase out the carbon tax. Now, we don't think it's right. People have to choose between their family budget, driving their kids to school, and saving the environment. So I would say that, Trump has made some dramatic threats and promises on this issue, but support for climate action has unraveled because of something that may seem counterintuitive. People in our province have been paying the carbon tax since 2008, and it's pretty high now. On my household natural gas bill, I'm paying more in carbon tax than I am for the gas. So I'm not on a budget. I can afford it. Big deal, right? But that's what people on budgets are saying too. So I wonder if this isn't connected to the regrettably short attention span that all of us seem to have on issues. Like, we're still getting horrible forest fires in British Columbia, and atmospheric rivers, and bomb cyclones, whatever the hell those are. And people are saying, I'm paying all this tax and nothing's happening. And worse, there are some countries in the world that aren't doing a damn thing, and that are generating more emissions than the entire province of British Columbia does in a year, right? So I think it's a global problem, and I honestly don't know where we're headed. British Columbia has very, very ambitious electrical vehicle mandates, and our electricity in BC is almost entirely hydropower. So we're not generating a lot of emissions from that. We ship coal out, but other people create the emissions, right? And we ship natural gas mostly to the United States, but we don't actually generate any power that way, except for a few Indigenous nation reserves where they have diesel generators, and we're phasing those out. So that's a great question, but I don't know where we're headed on that. I think the global consensus for action is unraveling.
Well, that wasn't very great to hear. Let's talk about something good. One more thing. Canada has a rising politician on the Conservative side,
yes.
Pierre Polidare?
Polyev.
Polidare.
Yes.
And I just wondered, is he the same sort of politician as Mr. Trump? Or do you think Justin Trudeau will lose the next election when it's called, probably in a year or so?
Yeah, Justin Trudeau has been Prime Minister since 2015. That is a long time to be in office in a time of relatively short attention spans. And I think if you can govern a country as challenged to govern as Canada for 10 years, you're probably ready to make way for somebody else. He hasn't. He's stubborn, and maybe he's waiting for the right person to come forward. I don't know, but the opinion polls suggest that he's gone when he gets around to calling an election. He has to do it next year, and as I said, his own party is quietly circulating petitions. Won't give their name yet, but saying it's time to go. The reason is because time for a change is a very potent political slogan, as we just discovered in British Columbia, as we discovered in the United States. And time for a change beneficiary in Canada is Pierre Poilievre. Fascinating guy in many ways. You have to be fluently bilingual in Canada, and he is. His wife speaks 3 languages. She's a Venezuelan immigrant. And she's pretty articulate too. Young family. Very polarizing. Not the kind... We've tended to have conservative leaders in Canada who are very diplomatic, who recognize that the country, the center of the Canadian political spectrum is kind of center-left. Sort of maybe even left Democrat in the States. And so our conservative leaders are kind of people who want to slow stuff down, not do anything too radical. Poilievre is quite different from that. He is, but, he get rid of the carbon tax. Well, that idea is taken off. Almost everybody's talking about that. He laments the lack of affordable housing. He'd like to clear a lot of the roadblocks to getting housing built. Well, that doesn't strike most people as being pretty radical. He wants to cut the budget of the CBC. That would be fairly dramatic, and I dread to think what would happen to a lot of my colleagues who work for the CBC. And the CBC is kind of a force for holding a big disparate country together, so that would be big. But he's in a lot of ways, he's a typical opposition politician. He doesn't like the way things are going. He denounces the failure to lock up violent offenders. He denounces the laxity of the bail system. But you don't get as much on how he would solve and fix all of that either. It's an opposition sort of thing. So, we'll try this one. I'm still trying to figure out how to work the fax machine in my office. I think the Trump comparison is unfair. I can see why he do it right all the time, because it's his opponent and he's trying to brand him. But of all the things one might say about Donald Trump, suggesting he's comparable to any other politician out there strikes me. That's a bit of a stretch. Even comparing this Trump to the one who governed from 2016 to 2020 strikes me as maybe a bit of a stretch, but we'll see. I've read an awful lot of American history, but I can't really think of anybody that would be a fair comparison to there, and I don't think Poilievre is a fair comparison on the world stage either. We'll see. He'll probably be Canada's Prime Minister, probably a year from now or so.
So we have 2 people out in the audience with mic, one in the back. Anybody have a question? Jane here is in the front.
Thank you very much for your comments. Always entertaining as well as informative. Despite your comment about being Pollyannish, I wonder if you could comment on the cabinet appointments because there is a clear pattern to some of us of total incompetence being appointed to critical positions, but maybe you don't think of it that way.
Well, I guess the first thing that jumped to my mind is whether or not they have simply he has simply nominated a bunch of provocateurs on the assumption that the worst of them will fail to pass approval in the Senate. You can get through some borderline calls if you've thrown up a couple of really big targets, and I guess we could argue about which ones those are. I got a note from my daughter last week saying, "Do you remember when you said there was no chance that RFK Jr. would be the health?" I said, "Yes, I remember." Anyway, so yeah, I think that would be my general comment. The other thing is, if we get one of these centralized administrations, our new premier yesterday appointed his cabinet. This premier in British Columbia, David Eby, his predecessor delegated. Eby doesn't delegate. He runs everything out of the premier's office. His cabinet ministers stand there on the public platform with him when he announces something. But we don't actually mistake them for the person who's actually in charge of the policy. So you begin to wonder just how important are cabinet posts in an administration where the power is being wielded by the president and the inner circle of advisors who aren't subject to approval by the Senate. So I think it's a little early to know what all this means, but the coverage is stimulating the right word to describe some of the choices. And look, it's the toughest job in the world, being president of the States, I would say, because there's so many other things you have to deal with and placate in order to govern. And when you've lost the election to a guy like that, and the Senate along with it, and maybe the House, and maybe the popular vote, I think that's now in doubt, and he controls the Supreme Court, you might want to spend, with due respect, you might want to spend a week or two reflecting on what you got wrong before you decide to get ready and take him on for the next term. And the other thing to me that's wonderful about the American system, the elections for the House of Representatives are only 2 years away. And it's pretty damn hard to run the country without a majority in the House of Representatives. So, one of the best political cartoons in Canadian history is a guy named Terry Mosher, and his cartoon, which is still famous, is the one that ran in the Montreal English language newspaper the morning after René Lévesque and the Separatists won the election in Quebec. And this was the first time we'd elected a separatist government. And they were damned and determined to take Quebec out of Canada. They're still there. This was in 1976. And the cartoon was René Lévesque. He was a chain smoker, so he's got a cigarette in his mouth and another one in his hand. And he says to Canada, "Okay, everybody, take a Valium." Take a Valium. Not bad.
Amy, do you have somebody back there?
I can stop that. Hi, my name's Kit. Thanks for being here. My question for you is, with your long history in journalism, do you think that there's anything that journalists or journalism organizations can do to try and attract people people back towards fact and actual, the kind of reporting that you're talking about, not the predicting and the pontificating about what we did wrong or whatever. Because I feel like one of our biggest divisions is that people are able to choose their sources of information, and we're not all talking about the same things in the same way. And I'm just wondering if you think there's anything.
Well, I think first of all you put your finger on the problem, which is that 50, 60% of the public is getting their information from non-traditional sources. And many non-traditional sources, the algorithm only gives you what you've already asked for. So there's not a really annoying editor like some of the ones I've had who insist on putting stuff in the paper that I don't agree with and that my readers might disagree with. So that's the reality. I continue to hope that the platform in the broadest sense, that may well include print or an evening newscast or the public affairs radio show that I appear on every morning in Vancouver, that there will still be a place for that. But I think it will have to be supplemented by a lot of other freely available information because people don't have to pay for what they get on social media. So I think there will have to be more podcasts. And I think there will have to be more just general kinds of information. People used to buy the newspaper when we had a high circulation. It was hard for those of us who thought we were investigative journalists, but an awful lot of people bought the paper for the TV listings or movie ads, or they were in a hockey pool and they bought it for the 6 point on last night's scoring. Like they weren't necessarily buying it for the investigative. So I think, making yourself a reliable source of information, broadly spread. I agreed. I don't know if you saw Jeff Bezos explaining why the Washington Post didn't endorse this. But I thought he made a pretty good argument that many people assume that if the paper endorsed someone for the presidency, their news was skewed in that direction. Now, news organizations will tell you that's not the case, and most news organizations have a firewall between the editorial page and the reporting staff, but I can see how people draw a different conclusion. In addition to which, if there's any doubt to any regular reader of the Washington Post, and I read it every day, who the hell they were going to endorse. Like it wasn't a surprise what they were going to do. So I think we need to think some about that issue too, which is, are we casting our content wide enough, and are we using our reporting staff to the best effect? We had, in the BC election, a journalism professor at one of our universities sent his journalism class on election night. Said, go find some place where the election is happening and just take notes. The old thing that reporters used to do. One of these reporters struck gold. She sat down with a candidate in a riding in the region of our provincial capital, candidate who was a medical doctor running for the Conservatives, who proceeded in the course of a 2-hour interview to explain to the reporter that the Indigenous people of British Columbia were savages. Well, 90% savages. And she went on and on about this, and the reporter's just nodding and running the tape recorder, right? That's something you do very well. She was the only person there, the only reporter there, because no one's got any reporting staff anymore. And she gave the tape, and her prof gave the tape, the Vancouver Sun, it was a front page story. Happily, that person didn't win, and happily, the party has said, you won't be welcome back. But to me, anybody can write an opinion piece, and I write them every day, right? But only a reporter can go to the meeting and get down on paper or on tape, on camera, what the person is actually saying. And I favor putting more of our limited resources into reporting. And even though opinion stuff, and a lot of organizations have people on staff, right, who write opinion pieces, and you'll see them in the paper, right, advocating this, that, and the other thing, right? Well, I mean, advocacy is important, and alerting people to issues and having columnists, and God knows I am one, is important. But I would say if you're trying to disperse scarce resources, pick some stories, pick some stuff that would benefit from reporting, and do more reporting. But that's me.
Let me have some other folks.
Yep, good.
Anything else in the front? Okay.
Oh, okay. Good afternoon. I was wondering if Canada has any laws that regulate the amount of contributions people can make to political candidates.
Yes, we do. And in British Columbia, we got some of the toughest laws in the country. So we used to be, the New York Times proclaimed us as such, the Wild West of financial contributions in Canada. There was no limits. And routinely, the government would sell tickets to fundraisers at $10,000 or $20,000 a piece, access, and it was basically with very few limits. The government that got elected in 2017 in British Columbia just ended it. Only individuals can give money to political parties, and it's capped, $2,500 a year, and indexed. So they got rid of big money overnight. There's a little cheating around the edges. You can register as a third-party advertiser and run ads, but again, there's a cap on it: $150,000, $200,000. You can loan staff to a political party to work for them in their after hours, and that. So there's still some of that. But no, it's changed British Columbia politics. It's one of the biggest changes we've had, and the government basically did it with a stroke of a pen. They passed legislation, but the legislation passed the House. They placated the warriors in their own parties by providing a taxpayer subsidy to political parties. So you get $1.81 for every vote, and every year. So there's a bit of a taxpayer subsidy for the parties. One of the opposition parties opposed it, but of course, when they realized they needed the money, so they now take it. And at the end of a campaign, if you or your party got 5% of the vote, the taxpayers pick up 50% of your election costs too. And the total spending is capped. So it's gotten a lot of the big money stuff out of politics, I would say, in general. There's some controversy around it, but it's nothing like the issues that you see, down here where people spend billions and lose. Yes. Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Thank you. Vaughn, recently a commentator on CNN who was a Democratic pollster was explaining why he thought Trump won. And he said, really, it wasn't about race, but if you made over $100,000 a year in the States, you generally would vote for Kamala Harris because it really didn't affect you that much. And if you made less than $30,000 a year, you voted Democratic as well because you were concerned about your entitlements. But it was that middle that elected Donald Trump. It wasn't minorities, and he got a much higher minority vote than in previous elections for Democrats. Is it something similar happening in BC? Can you see that same divide? The rich people vote for the Liberals, and the poor people vote for the Liberals, and the tax-paying people in the middle vote for the Conservatives.
I would say the election in BC was so close that the voting was spread around some. I would say that I think there's a problem with public policy making by people that aren't closely connected to the consequences of the policy. So it's not just the level of income. It can be both of you in your level of income. It can be an issue around, and I use the example of the tolls. I would use the example of safe injection sites for drugs. You don't want to live near one of those. I would say, are you well off enough to drive your children to school, or are you having to put them on the bus? And I think that's probably where it breaks down more. In both countries, we're reluctant to talk about class. But there's an aspect of economic class to this. You don't want to push it too hard. There are working class jobs that pay quite well, depending on the industry you're in. Mining pays very well in British Columbia. We still do it. Pays well. The LNG terminal is going to be paying well. But I think it's more of an analysis around the other thing you said, which is, do these policies affect you? The government is spending an awful lot of its time on policies that it either hasn't explained to people very well, or it is targeting a very small portion of the electorate with a very broad policy. Probably it has the kind of problem where it needs to go and find a populist in the best sense. A politician who, even if they don't necessarily come from that group, is able to communicate to that group. The Premier of BC who died last week, John Horgan, he was an actual worker. And one of his best lines was, he had his own hard hat. And he said, I wore it to protect my brain in the workplace, not for photo op. So there is, I think, it's amazing when you see, as I say, a populist in the best sense going across traditional groups and succeeding. I think one reason that our current Premier has done all that well is because he doesn't have, it's a cliche, common touch, the way his predecessor did. I think our current Prime Minister, the same. He is, and he's been around for 10 years. And when you've been around for 10 years in politics, people are probably going to get tired of you anyway. I think the American system of term limits for presidents does have its merits, although who knows? Maybe Trump will have that on his list. There I am, cheering you up again. Right? What is it? Is it the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution? I think it is. Yeah. Okay.
Chris, here.
Yes. Question relating to legacy media, because I'm a big believer. I think the competition that's come into Bellingham has really reinforced what the Herald has been able to do since. The Seattle Times, God help us, because I think it's primo, probably because of the economy in Seattle. But I wanted to push back a little bit, suggesting somehow, because of the diminution of the press in smaller communities, and it's been tough on them, and they're going away in many cases. And you mentioned Washington Post, New York Times. Those papers, if people read them, they can cut through the nonsense. I mean, George Will and Thiessen, they're still writing for Washington Post. They aren't going away.
Yeah.
And the 250,000 subscribers to the Washington Post who went nuts and left, sad. Why don't they just stop doing business with Amazon if they want to get back at Bezos? So anyway, my issue is legacy media is going to save us all.
I sincerely hope you're right. I see the struggle all the time. You're quite right about local coverage. Most of the small town newspapers in British Columbia have reduced staff, become ad sheets. We had the same thing happen to, just before the campaign, a very good local radio station in Kamloops, British Columbia, laid off the entire staff, gone to a music format. And local reporters had people that did the kind of reporting I just mentioned to you, where they sent the reporter in to the meeting and got the quotes. Yeah. I have not been. Well, I was in Portland last year, but I wasn't aware that the Oregonian has come back. That's great news. I really hope that the papers who focus on content and are able to keep delivering it can continue to pay their bills. There is one experiment being done in Canada. One of the newspapers in Quebec has incorporated itself as a non-profit and has gotten... somebody who works for my paper said, yeah, well, we're a non-profit as well, but that wasn't our business plan, right? But the one in Quebec has gone non-profit, and they got the Canadian government to say, yeah, you're a charity, you take donations, right, and have tax write-offs. But it's an interesting model. The Atlantic Monthly is sort of run that way. The UK Guardian has an endowment and is sort of run that way. So perhaps I don't much like the idea of government regulation of the news media because they'd never leave us alone. But I do like the idea that maybe the Channel 9 model, where you simply do fundraising and people get a tax break for doing it, might, especially if you could show that all of the money that comes in is going to increase the editorial content of the publication. Because the Canadian government has been diverting some money to local reporting and to even the major newspapers. There is a running controversy over whether or not the newspapers are into more coverage, or whether they're just using it to service their debt. But I do think there's possibilities there. I think it's very important not to give up. I think when you see what they do, what they can do, and does it have to be print? No, it probably doesn't have to be print, right? In the long run, we can save the trees if we can deliver it online. But I do think it's really important that it be independently edited, and that it be a serious attempt to balance, a major effort into reporting, and that it not just be seen as a vehicle for opinions and so forth. You should be able to do all of that. We'll see. I hope it's true. I've been very lucky to live through the golden age of the industry, right? And I'm very, very lucky. And here I am, 52 years later. Every now and then somebody in Vancouver goes, I wonder what old Palmer is doing over there in Victoria. Has he filed yet today?
I have one last question.
Yeah, for sure. Great.
I'm going to be very unfair and ask you to speak for all Canadians. But what was the reaction to the election results here? And what are the biggest hopes and biggest worries with this change coming up?
Well, if Canadians had been in charge, Adlai Stevenson would have been President of the United States. Hubert Horatio Humphrey would have been President. I'm going to forget some here. Michael Dukakis would have won. Walter Mondale would have won. John Kerry would have won. Al Gore would have won. And, of course, Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris would have won. And I probably dropped somebody in there. But George McGovern, very good. Is he the one who said, I wanted to run for president in the worst way, and I did. I can forgive him almost anything for that line. Anyway, so it is no more surprising that the Canadians are Democrats than that everybody in Hollywood is. So, you know, they were shocked and appalled. I would say overreacted. I mean, I'll give you an example. The deporting people. I don't imagine that the Canadian border is going to be flooded with the people they are deporting, assuming they can even do it. I think Canadian border does have a few places along it where we've had kind of an underground railroad of refugees and stuff. There's one in Quebec in particular, and Quebec government has managed to wring a whole bunch of money out of the federal government, $750 million, in order to adjust all those people. But I think the overreaction on that was you know, tariffs, understandable. Biggest trading partner, even though British Columbia is more diversified than most of the country, it's our biggest trading partner, and it's huge. And the automobile industry runs on just-in-time delivery, so that's understandable worry. But the overreaction was hysterical. You can go on various websites and see various Canadian commentators talking about it and sort of losing their cool and stuff. Okay, well, yeah, all right, but it was foreseeable that this was going to happen, and if you're going to be a professional about it, you need to sit down and go through it step by step and imagine responses and all that. The Prime Minister was fairly quick to come out and say, because he has dealt with Donald Trump before, not particularly well, but he has dealt with him, and that, you know, we've got our embassy there in Washington, D.C., right opposite Congress, and we're going to work away at it and try to deal with it. And we should have, ideally, a bunch of allies, and Europeans you were in Europe, were you not? There's someone anxious over there. But look, I think, as I said, it was certainly shocked and appalled. I don't see any point in us getting upset about it. I can see why Americans are upset. But I said, I think we need to be cool, calm, and rational, the way we're supposed to be in Canada. We're the nice people, aren't we? The ones that just, you know, just try to remain calm. Everybody thinks we're so nice they haven't met our hockey players, mind you. Anyway. Well, listen.
This was great. Thank you so much.
This has been wonderful, and I really, really appreciate it. And it's good to be back down here again. Thank you so much for your questions, for your patience, and for listening. Genuinely appreciated. All the best to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you.